Hey everyone, I'm Ben Harden. I'm a fellow here at Siebel Center for Design, and today I'll be taking you through our Fusion 360 Basic Modeling course. And in our Basic Modeling course and the rest of this workshop series, we'll be developing our model called the Training Train. And at the end of the workshop series, it'll look something like this. But for today, we're just going to focus on the basic modeling of it. So we're going to work on the Training Train body, the Training Train smokestack right here, the training train cabin top, as well as the training train cabin. So now that we've kind of understood what we're going to be modeling, let's just start with it. So when you open Fusion 360, most people's software will look something like this, which is just an open design file with nothing created in it yet. So you can see that you're in the design workspace right here. And there are multiple workspaces within Fusion 360 that have different purposes and things like that. You can do rendering, you can do animation, simulation, manufacturing, or doing drafting. But for our case today in the Fusion 360 modeling course, we're just going to focus on staying within the design workspace. And so if we take a look at our design workspace, we have our toolbar at the top, we have a view cube in the top right, we also have motion controls here, and then we have comments, and we have this thing here that doesn't have anything in it yet, but we'll talk about later. And then you also have your browser right here, which kind of gives the structure of the file. So the first thing that we're going to want to look at is the structure of the file and making some changes to that to make sure we're working properly and like setting up the file correctly. So the first thing that I normally do when I start modeling a file, depending on whatever I want to model, if the makes more sense to be in millimeters, such as for 3D printing, or if I'm doing a woodworking project, I'll change my units to inches or feet. So to do that, you can go into your document settings within the browser, and you can see what units you're in. And in my case, most of the modeling I do is for 3D printing, so I keep it in millimeters, but if you aren't in millimeters, say you're in inches or something, you can go ahead and click here, which will change your active units. And Fusion 360 allows you to change your active units for the type. So basically, anytime you enter a number, it will basically automatically set it to whatever unit you've chosen. And so if you're in some other one, such as like centimeter, millimeter, feet, or inches, you can go ahead and click this and change it to millimeters. And mine's already set to default, so it automatically sets as millimeters. But if that's not the case for you, for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to be working in millimeters. So just set it to millimeters. And then if you set it to millimeters, click OK. If it was already in millimeters, you can just hit cancel. And now that we have our unit set, the next thing we want to do is kind of set up the file structure of our larger design file to a degree. So Fusion 360 kind of works like most 3D modeling softwares or parametric modeling softwares work, which is basically like a 2D sketch with a bunch of numbers to create bodies and components. Or Fusion 360, they're called components, and other softwares are called parts or other things. But for Fusion 360, they're called components. And components are important because they allow you to do assembly drawings with them. You can reference them in other files, and they have more information than just like a basic 3D model, which is just called a body or a mesh. And components are really important because they have those extra features. So for our case, we want to set up those components now because we're creating multiple parts in our design file today. So we need to go ahead and set those up now because it's just better practice to kind of lay your file out before you start. So to do or create new components, you can go ahead and right click on the name of your file in the top left in the browser. And if you right click on it, you can see that it will allow you to create a new component. And so when I click new component, it'll bring up the kind of toolbox for that. And there are two types of components. There are standard components and there are sheet metal components. And in our case today, we're not working with any sheet metal. We're just doing basic 3D modeling. So we're going to stay within standard. And then there are two types of kind of references that you can do. You can create an external component where it'll create the component externally from the design file that we're in, and then it will reference it. Or you can create them internally and they'll be directly input into the design file essentially. And for our case today, since we're not going to do a lot of external reference with this file, we're just going to create them as internal components. And then the next thing it wants us to do is to name them. So to do that, we can do the first one, we're just going to call training train body. And then if you've done 3D modeling in the file already, you can convert the body that you had created into a component here. But for our case, since we're setting it up in the beginning, we don't have to worry about that. And then there's this thing called parents, which basically this component will reference something else and basically take some of its properties for that. And we want our parents for all cases for these components to just be reference of the design file itself, so we can take the properties that we set up in the design file. So the way that we set this up, it should already automatically reference the design file as our parent. And then the last thing here is the activates little checkbox. And if I check that, it will automatically activate this component and kind of bring me into that component when I create it. But in our case, we need to create 3 more components. So I'm just going to keep this unchecked for now. And then just click OK. Now if I look in my browser, I can see that it's created my first component right here. And you can see that it's nested below my design file. So now we just want to repeat the same thing for the next 3 components, keep the same settings, and we just want to call the second one training train cabin. And then we want to do a third one, which is called the training train cabin top. And then the last one will be the training train smokestack. So once we have that one done, we are good for creating all of our components, and we're kind of ready to start our 3D modeling. And to do that, the first thing that we're going to work on is the training train body. So to work on that component, we want to click on it, and we can see this little kind of circle next to it. And if we click that, it will activate it. So now we're working within this component. So any changes we make here will essentially be created within this component itself and not go into any other components, which is what we want. So yeah, as we talked about earlier, Fusion 360 is a parametric modeling software. So it's basically built on 2D sketches that are then have other features and stuff used to turn them into 3D models. So the first thing that we need to do when creating 3D models is creating a 2D sketch. So to do that, we can go up into our toolbar here and we can click create sketch. And then we want to create a sketch on a plane to reference a flat feature essentially. And for our case, we want it to be the XY plane. And the way that you can tell which plane is which or which axis is which is in Fusion 360, the basic, if you've done no changes to your colors or anything like that, the x-axis is this red axis here, the y-axis is this green axis here, and this blue axis is the z-axis. So for our case, we want the XY plane, so we just want the plane in between the X and the Y. So we're going to go ahead and click on that right here. And now we're in our 2D sketch. So now that we're in our 2D sketch, it gives us different sketching features to start to basically design our 2D sketch or our 2D parts. So to do that, the first thing that I want to do for this model is building the base of the body. So I'm just going to do a 2-point rectangle. And a 2-point rectangle, you just need to place 2 points. So the first point, I'm going to start at the origin here, and then I'm going to bring it out. And in our case, we want this to be 145 millimeters tall. So I'm just going to type it in that it was highlighted in my dimension, so I could just start typing in it. And I set it to 145, and then I want to bring the other one to 45. So to get to that other dimension, I can just hit tab and enter 45. And now that I've done that, I can just hit enter, and it will create this 2D rectangle right here. And if for any reason I want to change the length or the size of my dimensions, I can just double click on the dimension here and enter another number, such as like 123. But for our case, I do want to keep it on 145, so I'm just going to enter 145 and just hit enter. And you can see that it's automatically keeping it in millimeters because of our active units. And then the next thing that I want to do before we finish this sketch is I want to round over every single edge of these just to make the component or the body itself more structurally sound. Because if it's a like flat edge or like a sharp edge, it will be more likely to break or more likely to hit someone or scratch someone. So we just want to round over those edges. So to do that, I can just add a fillet, which is basically rounding over edges. And so I'm going to select that here in the modify section of the toolbar. And I'm just going to click on the corner. And then for our case, I want them to be 1.5 millimeters roundovers. And we can see that it's giving us a warning to do that. And it's because we removed the edge like points right here. And in our case, generally you don't want to ignore warnings, but for our case, this is fine because we don't really need to reference these corners in the future. So it should be fine. And then just keep continuing to do that for every single corner. And yeah, once you're done with that, we can go ahead and learn about finishing our sketch. So yeah, now that we've done this, we're done with this 2D sketch and its baseline level of what we need to bring it to. So now that we have this 2D sketch, we can hit Finish Sketch up in the top right. And now we can essentially start to work in turning this 2D sketch into a 3D model. And the most basic way of doing that is essentially using extrusion, which basically is a way to give a depth or a height to whatever your 2D sketch is. So basically just turns it into a solid of that same size with just a height. So with extrude, there's a couple different things that you want to look for in the toolbar. There's two different types of extrusions. There's a normal extrude, which just extrudes the entire area. There's a thin extrude, which just essentially creates walls. But for our case, we're just going to stick with the regular extrude. And then it wants you to select a profile. And in that case, it's usually a sketch or like a face of a 3D model. And you just need to select the one that you want. And since we had already selected that sketch, it automatically selected it as our profile. And then you can set its start point. You can start it on the profile, you can do offset, or you can start it on an object. But for our case, we're just going to keep it simple and start on the profile plane. And then you can change its direction. So you can do it move in one side if you want it to move in both directions, or you can do it symmetrical. The difference between two sides and symmetric is two sides allows you to give one side one direction and the other side another direction, versus symmetrical, they both move out in the same amount. And then extent type just allows you to set extent type to distance, object, or all the way through things. For our case right now, we're just going to go for distance, but we'll talk about these other extent types later in the video. And then for our case today, we want to set this distance to 15 millimeters. And then we want to set our taper angle to 0 still, because we don't want to taper it in or out. We just want this rectangular shape to a degree. So just keep the taper angle at 0. And then the most important part of the extrude is how you want it to work. So there are a couple different types of operations. There's a new body, which is what we're on right now. There's join, which kind of just creates a piece right there. There's cut, which will cut your extrusion into another body. There's intersect, where you'll create an intersection between an existing body and a new body. And then there's new body and new components. And we want to choose new body because we don't have any existing 3D object within our file. So we need to create a 3D object. So to do that, we need to create a new body. And in our case, we've already created a component for us, so we don't need to create a new component. So we're just going to select new body and hit OK. And now we can see that we have this 3D model right here. And it's kind of it's a 3D version of that 2D sketch that we just made. So now that we've done that, the next thing that we want to do is, just like we added some structural components with the fillets on the edge, we want to kind of do that with our edges here. So the first one I'm going to do is on the bottom. So I'm going to go up to my view cube in the top right. I'm going to select towards the bottom so I can see that bottom edge. And instead of a fillet on the bottom, I want to do a chamfer, which is just very similar to a fillet, but instead of a round over, it's just a flat edge. And this again will just help with not chipping or damaging itself or people. So when I do a chamfer, it will ask me to select an edge. And so I'm just going to select this bottom edge. And you can see that it's selecting all the edges. And the reason it's doing that is because I have tangent chain selected, which means if I select one edge, any edge that is connected to that edge on a line will automatically also be connected. So for our case here, we want to keep tangent chain on, but in the next fillet that we're or chamfer or fillet that we're going to do, we're going to show the difference. And we just want to keep it same type as equal distance. You can change it if you want, but for our case, we're just doing equal distance. And then you can change the corner type to whatever you want. For our case, it doesn't really matter, so we're just going to keep it on chamfer. And then now that we've selected it, it wants us to give it a distance. So again, we're just going to keep it at 1.5 because it's general good size for the size of this object. So let's click set it to 1.5 and click OK. And now we see that there is a chamfer all the way around the bottom and that it's created that offset for us. So now I want to do a fillet on the top, but since I'm doing a cutout towards the back for the cabin, I don't want to fillet those back edges. So we're going to do just like we did with chamfer, we're going to do a fillet, but this time we're going to keep tangent chain unselected. And we're just going to keep the radius type the same and the corner type the same. You can change it in the future if you need to, but for our case, we're just going to keep it simple and do constant rolling ball. And so now that I don't have tangent chain selected, it's going to ask me to select every single one of my edges that I want to do. So I want to select this right edge, this left edge, these two front corner edges, and then this front edge as well. And the corner edges might be a little bit harder to do, so you can just zoom in to do that using the zoom functions itself at the bottom, or there are shortcuts on your mouse or trackpad depending on what you work on. If you have a mouse, you can just do scroll wheel, or you can pinch to zoom on a trackpad. And then now that we've selected all the edges and we can see that we've selected 5 edges, we're just going to go ahead and set the radius again to 1.5. Select OK. And now we have a fillet on all these front edges. And it excluded this back edge because we're going to do some cutouts there. So now that we've done these basic blocks, it's a good time to go ahead and just save so we can start the version control for our file. So you can just hit Control or Command S, or you can also go up to the top left and hit save. And then we just want to name the file itself. So I'm just going to call it our training train. And then since I'm recording a video, I'll just say video sample. And then I also want to do today's date. So today is 12/14. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that in my thing. And then it will ask you to save to a location. Depending on your file structure, you will want to change that, but you can always just keep it in default because I assume most people watching this video are just going to have default and admin projects, but depending on how you structure files, you may want to change this. So let's go ahead and click save. And now that we've clicked save, we can see that we have our first version of our file. So we're on V1. And as we save later, we'll go to different versions and we can do version control with that. So when we do the next save, we'll talk more about version control. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a cutout for our sketch or a cutout for our cabin. So we're going to go ahead and create it on our sketch on the top piece itself. And so we're just going to go ahead and use the create sketch feature again. And we're going to select the top face. And with this view, I think it just doesn't generally fit within the monitor very well. So you can go up to the view cube and just click these arrows here, which exist only when you're in sketches, and you can rotate your sketch 90 degrees. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create a rectangle for my cutouts, but I want the rectangle to be 2 millimeters offset from this. And I want it to be on very specific points. So the way I'm going to do that is there's this thing called construction lines, and construction lines are basically important lines that you can use for using offsets, or basically they're parts of your sketch that aren't contributing to the geometry and they won't be used for 3D modeling. So there's kind of like guidelines to a degree. So to create a line, we can just go up in the top left, select the line. And for our construction line that we're going to create, we want to just click somewhere below the body itself and then just make sure that it stays 90 degrees. So make sure the degree you can see is 0, 0 or 180, and then just click somewhere past it. And then once you've done that, it'll ask you to kind of create another line. You can just hit escape to get out of that. And to turn this line into a construction line, we'll go ahead and click on it. And we can go over to the sketch palette right here and turn this into a construction line. So now we can see that it's a construction line by the fact that it's dotted. And in order to make this line offset from this edge at a specific distance, we can go ahead and do a sketch dimension, which is up here in the toolbar. And for sketch dimension, we just click here and we'll click the line that we want to constrain, as well as the line that we're constraining it to. So we're just gonna go ahead and create that dimension right there, and then we're gonna set it to 2 millimeters. And we can see that it's offset 2 millimeters now, which is perfect for our use case. And now we want to create a rectangle, and we want to meet the intersection point between this kind of fillet edge right here, where the round over ends, and the line itself that we just created. So Fusion is generally pretty good about snapping to objects that you create, but you can always zoom in to double check. And for me, it automatically snapped to it, so we're just going to go ahead and click and drag across. And we want this rectangle to be 35 by 42, and it should automatically set to 42 because it should snap to the other edge that we want. But if not, just make sure it's set to 42, and then click OK to create that rectangle, or enter. And then now that we've created this rectangle, I want to create a slot for basically something to stick into it. But, and to do that, I want to create another rectangle within this rectangle. But unfortunately, it's going to be, or it would be harder for me to essentially try and create another rectangle with perfect offsets on each side. So luckily for us, there is an important tool or a cool tool called the offset tool, which essentially can just create another version of whatever you created, offset a specific distance. So in our case, we just want to create this rectangle and offset it into our other one. And for our case, we want the offset position to be negative 3.25. So we're just going to select negative 3.25 and hit OK. And now we've created another rectangle perfectly offset every which way, 3.25 millimeters. So now that we're done with that, we can go ahead and finish sketch. We can go and create another extrusion. And we're just going to select this slot that we want to cut out. And this time we want to change the distance to -4. And you can see that Fusion is generally pretty smart about understanding what operation you want to do. So it automatically set it to cut for us, but sometimes it might not always do that. So it's always good to double check what operation is automatically set. So, and just change it if you need to. So now that it's cutting, we can just select OK. And now we have this slot for our cabin to essentially go into. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and create a sketch on this plane because we want to create another slot for a conductor to eventually sit into. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a sketch on this top face right here. And we'll go ahead and do that same thing just to make it easier to view. And then I want to create a circle in the center of this rectangle. So a quick way of doing that is just using geometry. And if I create 2 lines that are diagonal across the rectangle, and wherever they meet will be the center point of that rectangle. So if I do that, where these 2 meet right here is automatically the center point. But again, I don't want these to be part of the geometry, so I can just turn them into construction lines. So I'm just going to do that with the sketch palette. And if you want the shortcut for that, the shortcut is X to turn things into construction lines or geometry. And then we want to create a circle, so I'm going to go up into the top and I'm going to do a center diameter circle. I'm going to select the center point right here, and I'm just going to drag my circle out, and I want it to be 26.5 millimeters. Then just click OK, and I can see that it's created a circle now for me. I'm going to go ahead and finish the sketch, and then I'm going to do another extrusion, and this time I want it to be -2.5, and it automatically did the cut for me, so that's going to be OK, and I'm just going to select OK. And now that we've created this cutout for our cabin, we're going to go ahead and save. Not that Fusion is a particularly unreliable software, but it's just better practice to kind of save as you go. And so we're going to save. And after we save for the first time, it's going to give us the option to add basically comments about what we've done. So the version description allows you to add comments about what you've modified since last time. And this is particularly helpful, especially if you're working on 3D modeling with a group of people, other users, things like that. It allows people to understand what has been done since the last save. So it's good practice, like if you're coding or anything else, to kind of give good comments about what you're doing. So for a version description, I just generally like to say what I've changed since the last one. So I'm just going to say cutouts for cabin complete, and then type OK. You also have the option to do milestones, which are like bigger changes in the project. But for our case, we haven't completed anything yet, so I'm not going to do milestones. But I'll show you how milestones work later. And click OK. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to create the engine for our training trained body. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch on the front face. And this time I want to create another construction line, but I want this one to be a midpoint line so I can center my circle on this front edge. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and create another line, make sure that it's perpendicular. If I didn't have it be perpendicular, if I accidentally did something like this, there are these things called constraints, and constraints allow us to do specific things. And one of the specific constraints is perpendicular. So I can go ahead, and when you're doing constraints, the first thing that you need to kind of account for is you want to select the object or the thing that you want to be constrained, essentially. So I want this line to be perpendicular. So I need to select the line first, and then I want to select something that I want it to be perpendicular to. And this works for all of our constraints. So I want this line to be perpendicular to one of these edges, like these flat edges. So I'm just going to select one of these now, and it automatically sets it perpendicular for me, which is awesome. And then again, since we're doing this as like a midline, we're going to turn it into a construction line. And then we're going to learn another constraint, which is called midpoint. So again, we're going to select the line, and then we're going to select an edge because we want it to be in the middle, these two midpoints to meet, essentially. And now that I have this line centered on our face, we're going to go ahead and create a circle on that line just to make sure that it's in the middle, and it will automatically snap to it like it does. And we're just going to select it, and we want to draw a circle that is 36 millimeters. And for this case, I want this center point to be a certain distance from this bottom edge right here. So to do that, I'm going to do a sketch dimension, and I'm going to select this point, and I'm going to select this bottom edge. Oh, I think I had already selected the circle, so I need to select again. And I'm going to select them, and then I want this to be 30 millimeters away from it. So now it's constrained to how I want it, and you can see that the circle has gone to, it's no longer blue, it's black, which means it's fully constrained, which is something we kind of want to do within our sketches. So we're going to go ahead and finish the sketch, and we're going to do another extrusion. So we just need to select the sketch that we just created. And then this time, instead of extent type distance, I don't know how long this distance is. I guess I could calculate it, but I don't know what it is. So I'm just going to do toObject instead. And by doing toObject, I can automatically snap to a specific location. So I want it to come all the way to this like front edge right here. So I just need to zoom in a little bit so I can be more particular with my points, and I can see that it's highlighting this front edge now, so I'm going to select it, and it automatically snaps to this point. But this is one of the times that we can see Fusion isn't always so good about understanding what you want to do. In this case, I don't want to do a cut. I want to do a join because I want to add this engine on. So I just need to change that to join instead. And then click OK, and now I have this I have my engine complete. And now that I look at this, we can see that this front fillet kind of doesn't look too nice with this engine. So there's a handy feature in Fusion that we kind of hinted at earlier, which is called the timeline feature. And it basically allows us to see our work over time. So if this part right here, this like line, is where I am in my timeline. So if I drag this back, I can see my changes over time. And in our case, I want to drag right before we get to our fillets, because if I drag after the fillets, they don't exist anymore, so I can't edit them. But I'll drag right after they're created, and I'll go ahead and double click on them so I can edit them. And so I want to deselect these front edges, but currently I can't do that because those edges don't technically exist. So I just have to set my radius to 0 first. And now I can deselect these edges. So I'm going to deselect these front 3 edges, including the 2 tiny roundover ones. And so now that I've done that, I can see that I only have the left and the right one selected, 2 edges. I'm going to set it back to 1.5 and click OK. And then I'm going to drag my timeline feature back, and I can see that that change has persisted into the rest of the model itself. And like we saw earlier, Fusion has a warning system. So if this messes with anything, before you make the change, Fusion will warn you and tell you that it's going to cause issues down the line. So just make sure that you're not making changes that are going to break your model if you're using the timeline feature. So yeah, now that we've kind of done this engine, the next thing that we want to do is we want to create holes for our wheels. So in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a sketch on the side face of our model. And we're going to go ahead and again create another midpoint line. So just to do that, we're going to draw a line across, turn it to a construction line, and then use midpoint and select one of the edges so it's in the middle. But in this case, I can see that since both of the midpoints, it meets the midpoint of this line and the midpoint of that line, it doesn't go all the way across. So to do that, since this isn't really part of the geometry, I don't really care if it goes all the way out into space. So I can just drag the point and extend the line essentially. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create 3 3.5 millimeter circles on this center edge. And it doesn't really matter where they are on the center line. They just have to be somewhere on the center line. And then we'll add sketch dimensions to place them after we create them. And if you're creating center diameter circles, you can hit C, and that's the shortcut to use center diameter circles. And then we're going to go ahead and do some sketch dimensions. So for this one, I want this center point to be 20 millimeters away from the front. And then I want the distance between the circles to all be 52.5. So these both need to be 52.5 away from each other. And now that we've done that, they are all distributed evenly across the body. And we're going to go ahead and finish sketch. And this time, I don't want to do an extrusion because I want these like holes to be threaded. And the way to do that is creating things using the hole feature. So to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and use the hole feature right here, which is called hole. And I can go ahead and select points or features essentially to turn into holes. So I'm going to select each one of these, and now it's trying to create holes, and it will give us some options to do that. So the first one is hole type. So we can do a simple hole. It can be a counterbore or countersink if you have screws for those particular types. And then the one that we're going to focus on more is the hole tap type. So you can do a simple, which means it won't have threads, a clearance hole, which means it will just cut it out. And then there's tapped holes, which is what we want because tapped holes have threads in them. So we're going to go ahead and select tapped holes. And then we don't want to do any thread offset or anything like that. So we're not going to worry about that. And then we can just keep drill point as an angle because most screws, depending on where you get them, will have an angle. So for our case, we need to go 12.5 millimeters down because that's the screws that we've kind of planned for. And then we want to change, we can keep the angle of the screw the same, and then we want to change the size of our screw. So it allows you to choose specific profiled screws that already exist or profiled threads that exist. So we generally want to keep it the same so it's easier to find screws or parts for this model itself. So since we're working in metric already, since we're working in millimeters, we're going to keep it on an isometric profile. And then we want to change our size. Instead of 18, we want this to be 3.5, which is the same size we created our holes at. And then we can go ahead and keep the designation at M3.5 by 06, class 6H, and direction right-handed. And Fusion 360 has a really cool feature that not all modeling softwares have, which allows you to do modeled holes or non-modeled holes. So generally, how it works if the threads aren't modeled, it basically just like pastes an image of those threads in to your hole. But Fusion has the handy feature where you can actually model those threads and it will actually cut into the model itself. So in our case, we want our threads to be modeled. So we're going to tick the model checkbox. And when we have that, we can click OK. And now we've created holes on one side of our cabin, but we don't have holes on the other side. And we want them to be the same. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and there's this function called the mirror function, which will allow us to mirror these holes or threads across our body. But a mirror function works in a particular way where you can select specific features that you have, but you need to mirror them across something. And right now we don't really have a center line or anything or center point to mirror these over. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a construction plane. And construction planes are basically very similar to construction lines or construction geometry that we already talked about. And they're basically just a plain version of doing that. So it allows you to do, it just creates a plane that allows you to do that and not exist as part of the geometry. So for our case, we want to find something in the middle. So we're going to create a midplane. So to create a midplane, you just need to select two faces. So we're going to select the face that our threads are on. And then we also want to select the face that we want our threads to be on. So we're going to select the other side, click OK. And we can see that it looks pretty centered. So I'm just going to select OK. And now I can use the mirror feature because I can mirror over this plane. So object type, it may start as bodies, but for our case, since we created holes, those are considered features. They're not the whole body itself. And we don't have any sketches on faces. So we're going to go ahead and mirror this feature that we just created. So we need to select our feature, and it's going to be a little tricky to kind of sometimes highlight it. So you can always zoom in like we have to get a better chance of clicking it. And there we go. We've selected those holes, and then we just want to select a mirror plane, which is going to be the mid plane that we just created. Select it, and we can see if we go to the other side, it's going to cut these holes in for us. And compute type, for the case of this video, we're just going to keep it on just because that's just the most basic one, and we don't need to talk about the differences between the others. So just click OK. And now we can see that we've done that. We have holes on both sides, and they're threaded for both sides. So we now have our holes done for our wheels, and we just finished our engine. So it's probably another good time to save and just say engine and holes for wheels created. Just click OK. And then There's only a couple more things that we need to add to this body before we're done with it. So the first thing that we need to add is we need to add a smokestack or a spot for a smokestack to go into. And in order to do that, we need to create another construction plane. And this time we need to do a tangent plane because we're working with a cylinder. So tangent planes are really helpful anytime you're working with like any spherical object. So whether it be like a sphere or I guess I should say circular objects. So anything that's a cylinder, a sphere, a cone, things like that are really helpful. Tangent planes are kind of the only way that you can work with them to a degree. So we're going to go ahead and create a tangent plane, and it will create a plane tangent to a point on the cylinder. So I'm just going to select it, and it automatically created it on the top for me, which is good because that's where we want to create our smokestack. But if I needed to change the angle, I can always change it by dragging it or setting the angle here. And for our case, just want it to stay 0. Click OK. And now we have this tangent plane that we can work with. So I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch on the tangent plane. And now I can see that I'm working on this cylinder body itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create another midline like we have in the past because we don't have a center line yet. So turn it into a construction line. Use midpoint. Just select this front face. There we go. And I'm going to create a circle on this midplane or this midpoint or this midline. And the circle is going to be 10 millimeters. So I'm just going to do a center point circle, do 10 millimeters. And then I also want the circle to be 15 millimeters from the front face. So I'm just going to do another sketch dimension for that and set it to 15. And then click Finish Sketch. And now I'm done with that sketch. So I'm just going to go ahead and I want to cut a spot for the slot. And for our case, we want it to be -5 and we want it to cut. So we're just going to select OK. And now we can see that we have a spot for our smokestack. But if we're looking at this and we have a smokestack, we just have a slot here. So if we put a smokestack in there, it's not going to be super secure. It's going to kind of wobble around in it. Or if we secured it with like super glue or something, we wouldn't be able to essentially ever take it out. So what we can do is we can create another hole so we can thread in a screw to attach our smokestack to the top so we can keep it secure but also have the ability to take it out. So I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch on this little face right here that we just cut out. And I'm going to go ahead and create another midpoint circle. And I want it to be 3.5 again. Select OK. Go ahead and finish the sketch. And I'm going to use the whole feature again. And we want everything to stay the same. We want to use the same isometric profile, 3.5, but we're going to change the distance this time because we already essentially went down 5 millimeters. So we can't go down 5 millimeters again, or we can't go the full 12 again, because if we do, it will go into our model, or we'll never reach the end with the screw. So we can just change this to 7 instead and keep it the same ISO profile, but our case, it changed it, so we want to go back to 3.5 and 7 millimeters. And the reason we want it at 3.5 is because if we're buying a pack of screws to put our wheels on, we might as well use the same screws everywhere else because packs of screws usually come in 25 or 50. So you want to try and reuse your screws if you can. So in our case, we don't need a specific type. We just want to keep it the same. So we can just use more screws that we buy. Click OK. And now we've created this threaded hole in the top for our smokestack to get screwed into. And now that we've created this slot for our smokestack, we want to go ahead and learn about a new feature, which is called embossing. And embossing or debossing is a way to add like text or a logo to your object itself. And so we want to label what this train is. So we're going to go ahead, and in order to emboss, we need some text to emboss. So we're going to go ahead, and I want to put it on the cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and create another tangent plane on the side of the cylinder. And if I click more towards the side, it'll automatically assume I want to go at that like 90-degree angle. So I can just click OK. And I'm going to go ahead and create a sketch on that tangent plane. And in order to add text, we can go ahead and go into the crate and the text, and then it asks us to create a text box. So we just need to create a text box about the size of our train engine, and then we can type into it. And for our case, I'm just going to call, for the purposes of the video, I'm just going to label it training train. You can feel free to label it whatever you want. You can call it your name's train or well, whatever. You can change your font, you can change typeface and italicize. The one thing I wouldn't change right now would be the heights, because 10 millimeters is about a good height for the size of our cylinder itself. So I wouldn't change that. And then just make sure instead of a line left and up, we should change it to a line center and middle so we can center it on our body. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now that I've created this text, I kind of want to center it on our body itself. So I need to go ahead and create another midline or center line. So I'm going to go ahead and do it in the same way that we've been doing it in the past. Create another construction line, midpoint to the front. Want to drag it across. And now I want to give all this stuff some dimension. So the first thing, I'm just going to dimension our text box. And I want it to be 95, which it already was, which is perfect. And then instead of 25, I want this to be 20. And now I want this to be 5 millimeters from the front, which it already is, which is perfect. And then to center this, you can see that there's this point right here. So I'm going to click this and the center line itself and give it a dimension. And unfortunately, Fusion won't allow you to set a dimension to 0. See, it's giving us a red number, but we're just going to set it really small, so it's basically as close to 0 as possible. And if I add too many zeros, it won't do it, but if you go about 3 or 4, you should be fine. And just click OK, and now it's basically zeroed. And that's just a neat trick if you don't have a way of centering stuff. So now that we're done with that, we can go ahead and finish sketch, and we can go ahead and use the emboss deboss tool. So we want to select sketch profile, which is our text, and we want to select the face that we want it on, and then keep tangent chain on, and then you can set your depth. A good depth for debossing stuff, especially with 3D printing, is about negative 0.55, so we're just going to set that to negative 0.55, and it automatically sets it to deboss because we have this negative number. So we're just going to keep that, and then alignment should be, just keep it to 0. And then the reason that we're doing embossing is because it wraps around the cylinder, versus if I were to extrude this, it would just cut into the cylinder itself, and the text wouldn't read as well. So just if we look, it just kind of cuts straight across into it instead of curving with the face itself. So that's why we use embossing and debossing in this instance. So now that we have that set, we can just go ahead and click OK. And I want to have this text on the other side, but if I were to mirror it, I wouldn't be able to read it on the other side. So I'm just going to follow the same process that we did and just quickly redo it on the other side. So I'm going to create a tangent plane, create a sketch on the tangent plane. This time I'll create the line first, just so it's not in my way, or my text isn't in the way. Turn it to a construction line, midpoint it, drag it across, and then I'm going to go ahead and create my text, and just drag it across, type in the text again, training train. Should automatically keep the text you had saved before. It should keep those properties. So you can keep them the same, or you can change them if you want. I'm just going to keep them all the same. Click OK. And now I want to dimension my stuff. Set this to 95. Set this one to 20. And then set the distance from the side and the front to be 5. And then set the center to be almost 0. And there we go, finish sketch. And we're going to go ahead and emboss again. We're using the emboss tool, but we'll actually be debossing. And everything should save from our previous one. Click OK. and now we have text on both sides. And then now that we've done that, the last thing that we want to do is we want to add the U of I logo on the front of the train. So to do that, we can go ahead and insert, and the way that you should have access to the U of I logo is it'll be in the link in the description of this video to download, and it will be an SVG file. So we can go ahead and insert an SVG. So go ahead, click insert, and then you'll do insert from my computer. And then you'll find the file itself. It should be called BlockEye SVG. It'll probably be in your downloads. In my case, it's in this specific folder. But we're going to do the BlockEye SVG, open it, and then it wants us to select a sketch plane to work on. So I want it on this front face. So I'm going to select the front face to work on. And if I can see, I see that the BlockEye is huge and way bigger than our train. So we're going to need to change its scale. So in our case, we just wanted to set it to 0.1. And that looks like it's about appropriate size for our train. So then for us, we're going to go ahead and set the X distance to 15 and the Y distance to -40 to kind of center it right on that engine right there. And once you do that, you can click OK and finish sketch. And now we're just going to do another emboss on this logo. And select the face. And there you go. We've now embossed the logo or debossed the logo. And it's generally better to do debossing than it is embossing, especially if you're 3D printing, because you'll have to support the item if it comes out. So in our case, we just want to keep it debossed. And yeah, that's the first part of the train done. So that's the train body done. So we're going to go ahead and save it and say text and smokestack, or text, logo, and smokestack slots added. And now we've reached a milestone at this point because we've completed our first component. So we're just going to do a milestone this time and say train body complete. Select OK to save it. And if we go to our data panel and we find our train that we're working on today, we can see that it has a milestone right here, which is located as, or marked as train body complete. And we can also see the commits or the messages that we added alongside with each save. So we're going to go ahead, close the data panel, and we can go ahead and move on to the cabin now. So the cabin is the next part, and we can see that once we've moved off the active component, it becomes like translucent. And you can also turn it completely off, so you no longer view it by turning off or like clicking the eye right here next to it. But for our case, we need this slot as part of the part for the next, or for the cabin, so we're going to keep it on for now. And then I'm just going to go to a top view, and I want to go ahead and create a sketch on this slot here at the bottom. And now I'm just going to go ahead and rotate stuff so it's easier. And I'm going to go ahead and just trace the two rectangles we had. And do that. And then finish the sketch. And I'm going to extrude it. And I'm just going to select, it's probably better if I go back to the top view. There we go. And come back. And then we just want this extruded up 44 millimeters because we want it to be 40 millimeters up, but we also cut in 4 millimeters. So we have to account for that 4. So yeah, we can select 44, hit OK. This time we want it to be a new body because we don't have any existing bodies within this component. We have bodies in the older components, but not in this one. So we select OK. And now we've created the body itself. And now we want to go ahead and create a back door. So we're going to go to the back, create a sketch on the back. I'm going to go ahead and create it on our center line. And I'm going to midpoint it again. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to draw a line on the side, and I'll draw a line on the other side. And I want these to be equal, so I can do a constraint here up at the top, which is called equal. So I can click this line and I can click this line, and now they're the same height. And then I also want these lines to be symmetrical over this line. And it looks like they might be there, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm just going to double check by doing symmetry. So for symmetry, again, just like all of our other constraints, we need to select the objects that we want to constrain to what they're going to be constrained to. So we need to select our lines first and then our symmetry line. There you go. It looks like they were slightly off, so it looks like it fixed it there. So now we're going to add some dimensions to these. So I'm going to make this 27 millimeters tall, and now they're both 27 millimeters. And then I want the distance between these two to be 12.5, which it looks like it already was, which is nice, but if it's not, just make sure you set it to 12.5. And now to complete the door, I want to add an arch. So to do that, I'm going to add an arc, and you can go up into create, find arc. For our case, we want to use a 3-point arc because it allows us to draw a line first. So I click here, draw a line at this point, connect it to this point. Now it draws a line, and then the third point is how big of an angle you want on your arc. In our case, I'm going to go ahead, make it kind of look like a half circle, but not go fully up because then it will cut out. So I'm just going to do about right here. And then that looks good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and finish sketch. And now I want to do an extrude, select this face, and I'll do a cut because I want to cut through. And then instead of distance, in case anything changes, I'm just going to do two objects, and I'm going to select the other side so it just goes right through that face right there. Click OK. And now we have this back door completed. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to do our side windows. So to do that, we're just going to create a sketch on one of the sides. And we want to draw a parallelogram. So to do that, we're just going to draw a line right here. Draw it about 20. Draw a line off to the side. Draw another line here, and then connect them both here. And that's the general shape of a parallelogram, but to make sure that's actually a parallelogram, we're going to go ahead and use parallel constraint, select these two edges, make sure they're parallel, and now we can see that they're parallel by the constraint right here. And then we just want to set some sizes of stuff. So this should be 20 millimeters. The distance between these 2 points, I want to be 10. And then I want this angle and this angle, or the angle between these two, to be 120. So the way I do angles is I just need to select the two lines that the angle is going to be formed by. So the angle for this one is formed by these two lines. So I'm going to select those two, and I'm going to set it to 120. And then I just want to get this towards the middle. So I'm going to select the top line and the side, or the top, and do 5. And then this front face and this one to 5. And that looks about centered to me. Go ahead and finish the sketch, and I'm going to extrude it. And I want to use the same window on both sides. So I'm just going to go ahead, do cut, drag this in, and then instead of distance, I want to do all. So it'll cut through all objects and automatically cut through both sides. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit OK, and now I've created the side windows. And the last thing we need to do in the cabin is create the front window so the conductor can look out. Go ahead and create a sketch on the front face and just draw a rectangle. And we're going to draw a rectangle, make sure not to get in the room of your cylinder right here. And we're just going to give it some dimensions. So this one's going to be 35. And then the height between the two should be 1.5. I want the height of the rectangle to be 5. And then I want the distance between these two to be 3.5. There you go. Now that I've set all of my dimensions and completely constrained it, I can go ahead and finish the sketch, and I'll extrude. And then just again, I'm going to do to object and just select the other edge and click OK. And that is the train cabin complete. So we can go ahead and save again and do train cabin cutout. and Windows, done, and then just do milestone, training train, cabin complete, and go ahead and save it. And now that we've finished that part, we can go ahead and move on to the training train cabin top. So to do the training train cabin top, we don't need the body, so we're just going to get rid of it so we don't have to worry about it. And we're going to create a sketch on this top face of our cabin body. And we want to use the offset feature like we learned earlier. And we want to offset a rectangle 4 millimeters off from the top of it. Click OK, finish the sketch. And then we want to extrude that one. And we can see that it's only extruding this edge. And the cool thing about extrude is you can select multiple profiles. So I'm just going to select every single profile here. So I want to make sure that I have this full top selected. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and drag it up. And I want it to be 20 millimeters, but I want it to reach a point. So we're actually going to use a taper angle this time. So I'm just going to kind of look through it. And generally, what I found for this is -60 is a good taper angle for this. So we're just going to go ahead and do operation new body, taper angle -60, and a distance of 20. Click OK. And that looks like it's good for our cabin top. So we can go ahead and save again and do training train or cabin sketched and extruded. And then just say training train cabin top complete as a milestone. Click OK. And now the last thing we want to work on is our smokestack. And I'm going to go ahead and bring back the body and just take some measurements or remember some stuff for the smokestack. So we can see that we need to make sure that we have our smokestack's bottom part, its radius can't be greater than 5 millimeters. So we just need to make sure that it's not over 5 millimeters in radius if we're creating circles. So now that we've checked that, we can go ahead and get rid of the body and everything else. So we just have a blank workspace to work with. And for the smokestack, we're going to learn a new tool, which is called Revolve. And Revolve essentially takes a sketch profile and it revolves that sketch profile around an axis. So essentially, it's good for making cylinders or any cylindrical shaped objects. So, or any patterns and things like that. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and use Revolve. So the first thing we need to do is create a sketch. And I'm going to create it on the XZ plane because I want to revolve around this Z axis right here. So I'm going to do the XZ axis or the XZ plane, select that to create my sketch on. And I'm going to create a line. And I'm just going to create a little 5 millimeter line to act as the edge for my little circle for the slot to go into, or the circle for it to go into the slot. And then I need to make sure my distance is less than 5 millimeters here. And we also want to give it some clearance. So instead of 5 millimeters, I'm going to give it 4.8 so it doesn't need to get like hammered in to automatically fit. And then we also need to make sure that we leave a hole in the center for the screw to go into. And the screw size is 3.5. So we need to do a line here that is 4.8 minus 1.75 because 1.75 is the radius of our screw because it's 3.5. So if we divide that in half, it's 3.5. And the cool thing about parametric modeling softwares is they allow you to do calculations within your dimensions. So I can do 4.8 minus 1.75 and it'll automatically give me that length, which is 3.05. And now that we've done that, we've kind of created the base constraints of that. So we're just going to drag this up to the 5. And then we're going to drag this over. And I want this to be 2.025 to give it some room for our screw head to go into. And then from here, we just need to make another flat line so it can go into it. And I'll make this 14. And then after that, whatever you want your smokestack to look like is up to you at this point. So you can make it look like a triangle like this and drag this point around to kind of mess with your triangle. You could even make it look more like a Everpine, like a Christmas tree, and do something like that. Or you can go ahead and do a point here and then do like an arc or something. But ultimately, whatever you make your smokestack look like is up to you at this point. For me personally, I think I'm just going to go ahead and do this and then get it out about right here. And then when I'm done making that, that looks a little thin, so I might drag it out more. Just go ahead and finish sketch. And then I can see that I have my sketch here, so I'm going to go to the revolve tool. The first thing it wants me to select is the axis, so I'm going to select the z-axis. And then it wants me to select my profile. So I'll go over and click on this so I can select. I'll select my little sketch that we just made, and then project axis, we'll just project it along the line. And then there's multiple extent types, so it should normally set it to partial, which means I can set how many degrees I want it to rotate. So I could actually say 270, and it won't go all the way around. It just go 3/4 of the way. But for our case, since we want to do a full cylinder, we're just going to do a full, and it's going to rotate the full way. And then again, operation, just keep it as new body. Click OK. And then in our case, I'm just going to drag this off a little bit. So if I just click on it and drag, it'll move it out of the way. And I can go ahead and bring everything back. And now if I select our main file as the active component, I can see all of our things put together. And now the last thing we want to do is go ahead and save and say smokestack sketched and revolved. And then milestone, smokestack, complete, and training train, basic model, done. So yeah, that is the end of the Fusion 360 basic modeling course. So I'm glad to have taught you guys some basic 3D modeling, and I hope to see you in our assembly and drafting workshops to finish this model. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and yeah, excited to see you in the future.